Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. I am your host, Mildred Warner, and a faculty member in the Department of City and Regional Planning and the Cornell Ashley School for Global Development and the Environment. Today, we're discussing rights of nature, a new paradigm for environmental protection. Rights of nature represents a groundbreaking shift in environmental protection, a legal framework that recognizes rivers, forests, and other natural entities as having inherent rights to exist, to flourish, and to remain clean. Indeed, even in the US, from the Mississippi River, which extends the full length of the country, to the Rappahannock River in Virginia, civil society groups and Native communities have advanced rights of nature as a justification for river protection. This transformative model emerged in the Global South, led by Ecuador, the first country to enshrine rights of nature in its constitution. It has since inspired movements and legal debates across the world, redefining the relationship between people and the planet. In this keynote panel, you will hear from lawyers, civil society activists, and academics who will discuss how rights of nature is being interpreted and applied in the courts of Ecuador. We will explore the challenges this paradigm faces and highlight the opportunities it creates for strengthening environmental protection and advancing sustainability. This conversation offers a rare, frontline look at the evolving global dialogue on environmental justice. This work is part of a collaboration between the Ashley School of Global Development and Environment at Cornell and the Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. It is supported by the Cornell Global Hubs program and the Paulson Institute for Global Development. Viewers, we're interested in hearing from you today, and we will take your questions, so please submit them in the chat. And heads up, we'll be posting resources, tools, and useful links in the chat as well. In addition, we'll be asking for your participation in a poll question, so be looking for that QR code later in the program. As always, today's live stream is being recorded and will be available to view shortly after the show is over today. The keynotes are addressed also on YouTube, LinkedIn Live, and Facebook Live, so we'll share those links to those channels as well. The first resource I would like to share is a link to the special issue just published on rights of nature. You can see that in the slide where there's a QR code, but also in the chat, there's a link, which is probably easier to click, that will take you to the articles, many of which will be discussed in today's presentation. Those are all free open access, so feel free to bookmark that link and you can go back to the articles later. Now, let me introduce our panel. Professor Andrés Martínez Moscoso is professor of law at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito. He's an environmental law scholar whose work focuses on water governance, environmental regulation, and the evolving recognition of nature in legal systems. He holds the Jean Monnet Chair from the European Commission, and he's a member of IUCN WCEL. Welcome, Andrés. Lisa Maria Madera will be our second speaker today. She's the founding board member of the Colectivo Rescate del Rio San Pedro. She's an Ecuadorian American writer, educator, and environmental advocate whose work bridges storytelling, community action, and ecological restoration. She has been a leader in efforts, and she's even a Climate Parent Fellow. She's committed to fostering community-based environmental stewardship and reimagining human relationships with the natural world. Welcome to Lisa Maria. Marta Echevarria is an environmental leader with over 3 decades of experience advancing conservation finance and nature-based solutions in Latin America. As president of EcoDecision LLC, she has pioneered innovative mechanisms to protect ecosystems, support local livelihoods, including water funds and environmental easements, and carbon initiatives. And she is a leader in the Women in Water Initiative, which worked on the Machangada River case, which we will hear about later in the program. Ramiro Avila Santamaria is a professor of law at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. But also what's very important for us today is that he was the judge of the Constitutional Court of Ecuador during the time when the first cases for rights of nature came together. So we'll be able to literally hear from someone on the front line of how the rights of nature got articulated in the Constitutional Court of Ecuador. Welcome, Judge Avila. And finally, Carlos Quixpe-Parra is an environmental engineer and PhD candidate in territorial sustainability at the University of Cuenca. He's a specialist in political ecology and social environmental conflicts, and he will be talking with us about social movements in Cuenca, an important city in the south of Ecuador. So with those introductions, I would like to begin the conversation with my colleague Andres Martinez from the Universidad San Francisco de Quito. Andres, can you help explain to our audience what is rights of nature and how the movement is growing around the world?
Thank you so much, Mildred. It's a pleasure to be here, and good afternoon for this excellent panel. Probably it's very important to understand, we could see in this slide, that rights of nature is not longer only a symbolic, it's not isolated, it's not a global, legal, and politic movement. What starts, for example, here in Ecuador in the global south, like recognition in the constitution, then this movement expands. For example, in Colombia, in Atrato River, a very interesting case through mining, illegal mining case, or probably in other country as New Zealand, like a different, totally different view with Wanganui River, and not necessarily in the constitution and not necessarily in the jurisprudence, in an act. And probably then we could see other possibilities as what happened, for example, in Peru with Marañón River, that Marañón River is one of the most important river that goes directly to Amazon basin. And then we move, of course, in the other side to Europe. And in Spain, of course, for example, Mar Menor Lagoon is the first case in Europe that recognized rights of nature. But with what happened, for example, in the United States, there are, like you said before, there are emerging local movements that are working through this concept. So this movement right now is not only legally identically everywhere, and it's not too easy like copy paste the model and to put in practice in other systems. And probably we, during this very interesting panel, we will talking about rivers. And for example, rivers become central symbols of rights of nature. And probably, especially for my own opinion, this connect specific ecosystems, cities, indigenous territories, and human survival as well. But probably the debate is very important through the need, of course, of governance. Governance that involves, for example, communities, scientists, local governments, and of course, the states. But probably in the next slide, we could see and to try to understand this idea of what is rights of nature. And rights of nature and the nature is not longer treated merely as a property or a research. Not the nature becomes right now a subject of rights. So let me explain like this. The classic environmental law protect nature because humans benefit from it. But right now, with the rights of nature movements, we change that logic. Why? Because now, right now, the nature itself becomes a subject of rights. So probably we could understand this more specifically in Ecuador, because in Ecuador became the first country in the world to constitutionalize rights of nature in 2008. So this is very important because we could connect the concept and the cosmovision of indigenous people. For example, the concept of Pachamama and Summa Causae is necessarily to understand, to try to connect humans through the ecosystem, not as a separate. It's like the harmony that we need. So rights of nature is not only right now a legal innovation, it's right now, for example, imagine the relation between society and living world. But let me explain more about the cases. So we have like a very interesting thing that we wrote with my colleague Mildred Warner that we search about the case of Monjas River, and here is the judge that wrote that decision, Ramiro, and probably he could tell our more about this very interesting case. But in this article, we explain how the anthropocentric view could connect with ecocentric view. Why? Because this is possible to connect right to the city, to rights of nature. Why? Because in this very interesting case, in the capital of Ecuador, Quito, we know that only 3% of the water, the wastewater, is treatment. So the problem is that this starts to eroding rights edge. So the problem is risk, of course. There are a lot of problems about quality of water, etc. And in this case, the judge connect not only one right of rights of nature. This connects with the ecosystem, with water quality, with, for example, sustainability, with heritage, and of course, with drinking water. And the last one, I will try to explain the last case that we explore. And this shows another river in Quito, and this Quito is the Machangara River. In this paper, we show that river restoration, it's not only a legal or technical issue, it's also a cultural, political, and emotional issue. And in Quito, and here is some of these incredible women's led movement are defending polluted rivers by combining cultural memory, citizen science, social mobilization, and strategic litigation. So in this paper, we show that education in actions could be through the people begin to see the river not only like a resource, is a liable entity with rights. So the key message, and to final this, is that rights of nature need civil society through articulation with science, culture, and law working together to become effective in practice.
Thank you very much, Andres. That was a really good introduction. And what I would like to do now is to turn to Lisa Maria Madera, who has been one of the civil society activists in this effort, and help us better understand this cultural connection to the river, which is so fundamental.
Thank you so much, Mildred. And hello, everyone. I'm really honored and grateful to be here with all of you today. My name is Lisa Maria Madera. I'm a mother, a writer, community weaver, and a river guardian with the Colectivo Rescate Rio San Pedro. And alongside this beautiful community, I've had the privilege of learning with the San Pedro, which you can see behind me, and the Machangara rivers in Quito, Ecuador. I'm joining you today from the flanks of the volcano Pichincha and the ancestral territory of the Kitucara peoples. And Mildred Andres, too, I want to thank you so much for making this gathering possible, and thank you as well to the Cornell team supporting this conversation. The voices of rivers are rising around us, and in Quito, we're learning to listen. Today, we're exploring the question, does rights of nature provide a new paradigm for environmental protection? And the spoiler alert is yes, it does. And I want to say a little bit more, because actually the rights of nature is not entirely a new paradigm, right? It reactivates an ancestral paradigm, an ancestral worldview, understanding that's rooted in relationship, in reciprocity, and the understanding that the living world is alive. And as Andres shared, rights of nature shifts our relationship with the living world, with Pachamama, our Mother Earth, from object, an object that can be used and abused at our whimsy and will, right, to subject, where we are equal subjects in front of the law, but also we understand that we're part of a living world. And in doing so, it changes the grammar of our relationship with the living world. We live in a world of relations. The Ecuadorian Constitution emerges from indigenous knowledge, ancestral knowledge systems and communities, living in relationship with rivers and mountains, forests and land. And at the center of this vision is Suma Causai, Buen Vivir, living in reciprocity and diversity and beauty and harmony with one another and with the living world. In Ecuador, many of us understand that rivers are living beings. Rivers hold memory. Rivers connect our communities. And in Robert McFarlane's recent book is A River Alive that I hope many of you have read or should be reading. And our dear friend Ramiro is part of this as a protagonist in this book, as is the Los Cedros forest. A beautiful book. In that book, Robert McFarlane writes, "The tree is a river wrapped in bark. A tree is a river wrapped in bark." And I would suggest that maybe we could think about a person as a river wrapped in skin. For us in Ecuador, this is not metaphor alone. We understand that rivers run through us and that rivers are alive. And because they're alive, rivers have rights. So I want to ask you a question right now. We're going to share a Slido QR code. What is the name of the body of water closest to you? And I invite you to take a moment to name your river or body of water, lakes or mangroves, because rights of nature begins with relationships. One of the paradigm shifts that occurs when we activate the rights of nature is that the river enters the conversation. The river is no longer the backdrop. The river becomes a teacher, a collaborator, a participant, a subject, right? A presence that we listen to, that we learn with, we take into account. Behind me, you can see the Rio San Pedro, the first river I met as a child, the first river my daughter met as a baby, the reason why I'm here, right? Without my relationship with the Rio San Pedro, I wouldn't be here with you today. And this is the San Pedro River behind us. So we're calling in, inviting the Rio San Pedro to accompany our conversation. And we invite as well the rivers, streams, lakes, mangroves, and oceans that surround you and sustain you and your territories. We want to include them and welcome our waterkin to this conversation today. 5 years ago in 2021, my friend Maribel Pasquel visited a small park along the Rio San Pedro with her daughter. And her daughter bent down to pick up a rock in the water, that sort of primal relationship we have with rivers, to pick up a rock and throw that rock in. And Maribel instinctively shouted, "Stop," because she knew the river was contaminated. Heartbroken by the state of the river and also the way that the contamination of the river disrupted this river mother-daughter relationship, right? Maribel took a photograph filled with trash and posted it online. Can we maybe see the next? Asking, what can we do? Thinking about what can we do in response to this devastation, really? And more than 300 people responded. It was the end of COVID, so what can we do also meant she organized a Zoom gathering. And scientists, neighbors, families, educators, artists, and activists showed up at that Zoom meeting and began listening together, learning together to understand why our river was suffering. The question remained, what can we do? And so someone suggested, let's organize a minga. A minga is an ancestral Andean practice of collective work for the common good. It's rooted in reciprocity, care, and shared responsibility for territory. And it's much like a barn raising in Amish communities. A minga brings people together around a common purpose. It activates collective intelligence, harnesses resources, builds a community capacity, weaves new relationships. And since that first minga 5 years ago, we have organized more than 32 intergenerational mingas, mobilizing over 20,000 volunteer hours, attracting thousands of volunteers to participate with us. We've removed over 19 tons of trash, and we've contributed to legal processes recognizing the Machangara River as a subject of rights. We were assigned from the judge a legal guardian of the Machangara River. And we're in the process of creating a pact, a governance body, to care for our San Pedro River. For us, mingas are not simply cleanups. They are eco-fiestas. New slide, please. Our mingas bring us back into relation with our river, where we weave together science, bird watching, storytelling, ritual, music, art, education, food, and ecological restoration. We read poems to our rivers together. Our rivers really like poems. And through this process, we are restoring not only our ecosystems, but our relationships with one another and with our rivers. In this way, rights of nature is lived, practiced, and defended through community, where we respect our rivers, where we restore our rivers, where we call our municipal authorities to clean up our rivers and to defend our rivers. And through this, we create sumak kausai. We live well. At a time of ecological crisis, social degradation, and mass extinction, rights of nature offers a transformative pathway toward community weaving and restoration, where we learn not only to think about, but to think with rivers. And for us, this work is both simple and profound. We want to swim in our rivers again. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share a tiny sliver of our experience with you, and I want to invite you to join us. We are going to share in the chat a link to our article, Quito's River Renaissance, Rescuing Our Rivers and Defending Their Rights in the Ecuadorian Andes. You can take a look and hear more about our story. There's also a sign-up form. You can join our mailing list and receive information about our upcoming conversations and program opportunities available later this summer. We're thinking with rivers and thinking about how we can join Sumat Kausay, Sumate al Sumat Kausay. And you can follow us on Instagram as well. We would love to connect with you, collaborate, and learn from our rivers together. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Lisa. And I wonder if we could show the slide of the Slido. We have quite a number of bodies of water that have been mentioned by you all. And it's interesting that the Machangara, which we're going to talk about next, the Pacific Ocean, which is next to Ecuador and the US, and Cayuga Lake, which is right here in Ithaca, New York, are all some of the most mentioned ones, as is the Mississippi, which is our longest river in the US. So thank you for that. I don't know if you have any other comments you want to make on that, Lisa, of how the Slido worked out.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see all these water bodies present, right? Because our rivers, our water bodies have rights. Some of our constitutions recognize them, some of the laws recognize them, but whether our laws recognize them or not, they have rights. And so I'm just really excited to see their presence here.
So now I want to thank you, Lisa. And to the audience, I want to say, I'm sure this discussion has stimulated some questions on your part. So please be sure to put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the show. But in this next segment, I want to turn our attention to how rights of nature has been integrated into the Ecuadorian Constitution. As Andres said at the top of the program, it's the first national constitution to do this anywhere in the world. I'd like to invite Marta Echevarria was a leader in bringing the Machangara case in Ecuador. Could you give us some background on where the idea of rights of nature came from?
It's a long process, and I have to say that I was involved as a translator with the initial visits, but basically Ecuador was going through the constitutional reform, and there was an interest to bring the experience of the discussion overseas and also to link it to the process of the indigenous groups, indigenous rights in Ecuador, which is a very strong political process of many decades before we were talking about environment. So what's fascinating is that we're linking human rights with nature rights because they're, as Andres mentioned, intrinsically linked. And with the Constitution, we create a framework that I think Ramiro will expand on, but it allows us to think of legal tools to recognize that nature can be defended and nature can be present in the legal system. It is a long list of people that were involved with the support of international organizations, with the local basis of what nature is for the indigenous groups, which traditionally are very much a part of their livelihood, of their existence, of their cosmology. And I think it's been explained before, but I think what is fascinating, and I come at this as a public policy maker, involved as an environmental management consultant for many years in different mechanisms, where we find that this is a new tool in our toolbox to position and defend environmental quality.
Thank you very much, Marta. I wonder now if we might turn to how the cases are working out in practice. And you, Judge Avila, when you were judge, you were part of the first cases that came through. So I would like to ask to help explain to us how you and how the court interpreted rights of nature, because it's a new paradigm coming into a traditional legal paradigm. Weren't there some clashes?
you, Mildred. I want to say hello to everyone. Um, yeah, there's a clash. Actually, since the rights of nature were recognized in the Constitution, we have to wait some years until we have a legal successful cases. And I think to articulate cases in courts requires at least two great conditions. The first one is people aware, consciousness, people with consciousness, with ecological consciousness, and also the cases require scientific information. Um, in this first requirement, people with consciousness, the first group of people that we need in court are people who file lawsuits. So these people like Lisa or Marta must have consciousness of the contamination, the degradation, the pollution, and to see the rivers, for instance, or any ecosystem as a living thing. You need this consciousness. In the case of in the case of Machancara River, for instance, the Kitukara Quichua indigenous people filed the suit. So the first thing is people with consciousness. The second thing, which is not easy, is lawyers with consciousness. And not any lawyer has the ability to see nature as a subject. If you go to any law school around the world, you learn that nature is an object that could be exploited, sell it, use it, abuse it. So the second group of people, lawyers with consciousness, it is not easy. And lawyers needs a different theory than the property law. So you need, I call the systematic theory of law, which needs and requires the dialogue between law with indigenous knowledge and also law with science. And the third group of people that you need, which is not easy either, is judges with consciousness. And because in the general culture, the judges, as any lawyer, consider nature as an object. So when for instance, in the case of Machangaro River, I was not a judge there. I was a litigant. The judge asked at some point in the audience, she says, "Hey, lawyer, tell me what do we require to declare that the Machangara River is a subject?" And I said to her, if you consider as an object, we can still pollute it as much as we can. But if you consider as a subject, you have to see as a living person, and you will see a river as a sick body of water, and so you need judge with some sensibility to these new paradigms. And the second requirement is data. If you don't have, say, scientific information, probably you can get a successful case. Data is a key question in cases. We have constitutional law, we have jurisprudence, we have indigenous knowledge, very important. But if you want to win a case, you need data. What is the vital cycle of a river? What is the structure? What is the function? How many oxygen do you need in a river to consider it that it is a healthy river? What kind of living beings used to live before the contamination in a river? All that stuff, you need biologists, hydrologists, scientific person who can give not only the consideration of what's going on with this ecosystem, but also to give a real solution to the river, to the restoration. So with people, judges, lawyers, litigants, civil society, with ecological consciousness of this new paradigm, and also with data, then you can explain the cases that we have had here in Ecuador. That would be my answer, Mildred.
Thank you very much, Ramiro. That's very helpful. Marta, I want to bring you back in because since you were one of the litigants in the earlier case, what kinds of data and consciousness raising that Judge Avila talked about did you all help bring into the case?
Yeah, so we have a group of women, we call them Women in Water, which are all professionals in the water space who came together right during COVID, working all over the world, and we were not working in our backyard. We were not looking at the body of water that was right next to us. So we decided that we needed to work towards restoring the river and started doing walks. So we love Women in Water walks. And bringing the decision makers to look at the river. Because if you guys have a chance to visit Quito, most of the construction does not even look at the river. It turns its back to the river. And all of a sudden, people don't even know that it's right behind you. And all the effluent is being dumped, almost 97% without treatment. So we decided to start looking and gathering the information that was available. And fortunately, among our group are the key scientists that have been monitoring. We find that Quito has loads almost similar to the incoming effluent into the treatment plants of Paris. So we're talking huge organic loads. We also have nanoplastics. We also have high level of viral counts. So we're talking that the evidence suggests that we've been killing the river. Fortunately, since we're in a tropical setting and we are in an area of the Andes with a huge change of elevation and physical mobility of the river, we could restore it if we take away those stressors. And I think that's what is fascinating. And all that evidence was presented during the case by the experts who were monitoring the river. We had a combination of aquatic ecologists, we had a combination of hydrologists, and so making sure, and also historians, environmental historians, to highlight what was the history of the river and what do we want to get back to. Maybe we can't get back to the pristine setting, but we should at least try to get back to swimming in the river, as Lisa said. And that's what we all aim. I would like to swim before I die, so that's the focus of the group. And I think what's been fascinating, thank you to all the work of people like Ramiro, Andres, and the lawyers with conscience to bring this information. And also the judge. The judge was very sensitive to the information, to the point that she recognized also the group of women that were behind this river, which was kind of an interesting setting because there are a lot of women working in water, even though traditionally it's been a space dominated by men.
That's really interesting how science, law, social mobilization, and women's leadership have come together to really push this forward. Before we move we have some questions in the chat, and I want audience to keep putting more in about this framework. But before we do that, I want to bring Carlos Quixpe-Parra into the conversation because this role of social movements and culture and civil society is really important. And Carlos comes to us from Cuenca in the south of Ecuador, where the Quimsacocha River is under threat. Carlos, would you like to speak to this?
Okay, thank you, Mildred, and hello everyone who joined us on this beautiful panel today. Yes, the arts and the social movements have a very strong link in terms of defense of water here in Cuenca. For the people who doesn't know, Cuenca is the third city of Ecuador in terms of political influence and in terms of population. And there are a lot of mountains around Cuenca, which importance in terms of hydrological supplies are highly significant for the population. Yes, in terms of mobilization, the arts have a very specific and very key and very important role. Now, because arts and mobilization can move even more people. And there are a very specific example of that. On September 26th of the last year, there are a huge movement. There are 4 rivers on Cuenca, and the Cuencanos call this river the 5th river, but there are not a physical river. There are a river of people, of collectives and citizens that are doing something fundamental, reconnecting the city with these rivers, and there are important significance. This is a draw of a journalist that days after the Field River show that people of Cuenca protect our rivers of the river basins with the mobilization. Now, next slide, please. So we can see that arts in this case have a very role. We can see examples of flyers and posters that different collectives of arts made days before the march, before the parade. So we can see a link between the politics, the defense of water, and the arts in Cuenca, no? And even elements of nature like the beer in that poster. Then this slide, please. Yeah, as we can see in this slide, we can see there are more than 100,000 people on a city like Cuenca. It's powerful. So the importance of this mobilization is that there are as a whole city represented in this mobilization. We have even people with disabilities, people with high schools, universities, people of workers of every camp. So we can see a lot of mobilization, but there are another reality because Ecuador it's a country of extreme contrasts. On one hand, we have this mobilization, we have the rights of nature on our constitution, we have examples like lawyers that fight for the water and the nature, but on the other hand, and if we can go to another slide, we can see another reality. We can see the link between mining and narco trafficking, for instance. So we can see dark powers involved in destructive industries, and that is truly dark and dangerous. Because the fight of water now isn't just against large corporations and government projects. The rivers have been devoured by illegal mining, and it's about families spending for gold to survive. Now, there's a massive operation that we have become the primary money laundering machine for narco trafficking. So that's a dichotomy that we have in Ecuador now. Now, there are people that want to keep the nature values on the road, the values on the public sphere have a lot of pressure, not only of the states but only this illegal part of the society.
Thank you so much, Carlos. You have raised some really critical challenges here with illegal mining, narco trafficking, and the pressure of being an extractivist economy, which Ecuador is. And in fact, that was one of the questions raised by Mickey, one of our audience members. And I encourage other audience members to please put your questions into the chat because we'll be addressing them now. Mickey asked, while rights of nature is a transformative framework, in many cases it has been applied through reforms within capitalist and colonial frameworks. And I think that's what Carlos was just getting at here at the end of his presentation. And so a question for the panel is, how do you, or those you've worked with, think about how you navigate this tension between reform and transformative change? Who wants to start? Andres, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mildred. I will try to do this quickly, but I think it's necessarily to think that this movement from the global south try to change the vision, the cosmovision, and in some contexts, is try to respond for like the lack of efficiency, for example, from legal system. Because if you try to explain, I don't know, rights of nature in Europe, probably they will say that the classical environmental law works. But in our case, for example, in Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, during the last century, for example, we have a crisis about resources, specifically, for example, with mining, with oil, and we have a lot of problems of pollution. So with this new concept of rights of nature, we try to solve that problem, specifically to try to have like a new paradigm. The name of this panel is to try to think about new paradigms, and like a paradigm is a symbol, and it's not too easy to try to build that trail that's go directly to that, I don't know, summa causa, or probably that protection of Pachamama. I think there are a lot of steps, but probably, for example, these decisions or probably these recognitions are part of these steps, and of course, all the work that social movements do.
But somehow that doesn't get me far enough. I don't know, Ramiro, can you think about this? Or, I mean, we're talking about power here, and power of very powerful economic actors, and a new conceptual framework in the legal structure that wasn't working that well for environmental protection before. How is it that rights of nature gives it more power?
You know, what is the main tension that do we have, not only in Ecuador? Right now we have, a lot of political power in order to exploit mining and oiling. I mean, the main problem that we have, the name is capitalism. And a few weeks ago, a writer that I love so much, she's Eliane Broom, she wrote a piece of paper called A Loving Critique to Nature Rights Movement. And she said something like, you're using the rhetoric of subject of rights, you're dealing with, you're stopping sometimes this big and huge exploitation of oil and so on and so on. But the problem is that probably you're not addressing the main issue of the nature as an object, which is capitalism. And in capitalism, you want it or not, nature is an object, and the accumulation of wellness and all the system that we have right now is based upon the idea that you have to exploit as much as you can nature. And that's the main concern that we have right now. For instance, in Ecuador, we could get a popular consultation. Carlos mentioned one of them, which is Quimsacocha, and the other one is Yasuní. In Yasuní, which is a portion of the Amazonian forest, and there you have to isolate indigenous group of people, the Taromenani and Tagaeri. And most of Ecuadorians says, we rather choice not to exploit oil there, not only because there are indigenous isolated people there, but also because we have recognized rights of nature. And the government, even if the 60% of Ecuadorian people says no, do not exploit oil there, we are still exploiting the, oil. You know that's the problem. So the tension you mentioned is a deep down tension. To me, rights of nature is a kind of transition into something different that the capitalists are offering us. But that's the problem. When you are in court, you have this dilemma, which is so difficult dilemma. If you allow to explore to mining in some place with this big and huge corporation, you're gonna have $3,000 million every year. If you protect nature, if you don't have this consciousness of the rights of nature, it means you are wasting money. That's the tension, Mildred, and it's not easy tension. But to me, rise of nature is a way, a way to start thinking in a different way the world and also the economics.
So it's a way to start.
Yes.
And our listener, Mickey, has said, how do we get to transformative change? And one of the things you mentioned, Ramiro, was the raising the consciousness of the public. And that's where Lisa Maria, Marta, Carlos come in the work that you've been doing to raise consciousness. And can that consciousness raising shift power relations? You're
sure.
shaking your hand. Who wants to start with that one? Marta?
I believe that we, the people, have the power. We have to empower ourselves to take it. I don't want to minimize the size of the enemy and the size of the opposition, but I do think that at least talking as an environmental specialist, right, environmental manager, I believe that this is a tool that allows us to change the conversation. I'm coming at this as a traditional environmentalist where lawsuits in the US have been game changers over the years. In Latin America, a lot of the lawsuits have not been successful because of the power imbalance. With rights of nature, we do address that power imbalance because we do not have to prove that the damage was done, but rather who is responsible. And that's something that I'll let the lawyers explain the details, but allows us to change the conversation. Because before, a loss and damages framework, right, which is what worldwide is used to demonstrate environmental damage, means that you get into the fight like the tobacco companies did for so many years. They negated the damage and they could pay all the lawyers for a long time. In this case, we don't get into that debate, but rather we get who's responsible to take on this, because we're saying nature has a right. And therefore, you change the conversation and you open up the discussion. And now the governance structure, which is something that we have to demonstrate with all these nature rights lawsuits, make them work. How do we implement the governance structure? And in each case, you guys that read the literature are going to find that the governance structure in each place is a little different. At least in the case of the Machangara River, we've created a collective of collective movements and are trying to push the administration to fulfill the lawsuit, to come and deliver what the judge has said they need to deliver. And it's 27 measures, short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures, which the judge defined in the verdict. And I invite the audience to read it because she really did her homework. And I think it's basically a special management plan for the Machanga River. And us from the citizen side have to say, do it and do it well, and give them tools and support the administration, the municipal administration, to fulfill the timeline which is established in the lawsuit.
So, Marta, you've raised this issue of the role of the city. And Lisa Maria, I know your group has been appointed a guardian to watch over the Machangana River. How are you pressuring the city to be sure that it complies?
Well, I think it's a process with these collectives that Marta mentions, right? In this situation, it was appealed, the city appealed the case several times and they'd lost. And in the process now, they're being held to account. They have to fulfill the sentencing. And so we're working together to make that come together, make that come into being. I think with the national government right now, we have a president who, when he signed his oath, he didn't even sign on the Constitution, right? So there's not a commitment on the national level. Whereas on the local level, there's more commitment. The mayor has more responsibility. They're coming up for elections. And we know that our poisoned rivers can make us sick. And sort of cycling back around to that other question, I think is really important to think. The paradigm, the narrative shifts when we understand that extractivist economies and the capitalist economies that we are using are devouring the world. And they're poisoning our rivers, they're devouring the world. Right now, Europe is under a heat dome because of this failure to understand that we live in a relationship with the living world. If we look at it like we're on the train together, a paradigm is a train, with extractivist economies, we're on a train, and at the end of the train is the abyss. We are devouring the world, and it's leading us to burning up the planet, poisoning our rivers. We can't live that way. With the rights of nature, it's a paradigm shift, as if you're coming into a railroad junction where you shift the location, the destination of the train, and you go on a different relationship with the living world, and you understand that we're in relation with the living world. We must respect this living world, and in that relation, we need to find economies and ecologies of care that are river friendly, and that's the task that we have ahead. And it's a great responsibility and privilege and honor to think about this together.
And that's the idea of sumak kwasai that brings us into harmony as a paradigm rather than one that's based on development and growth and exploitation. We have 2 more questions from the audience and about 8 minutes left in our presentation, and both of them ask us to look beyond the local and look up at the international level. Maria asked, in what ways do you think the advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights could help advance similar cases in other jurisdictions? Does someone want to pick up on that? Andres.
Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting to understand how the jurisprudence and, of course, opinions as well of the Inter-American Human Rights Courts make like an evolution in the last 5 years, specifically because if we could see, for example, in 2 different cases, the first one is the case with Argentina, is Yaca against Argentina. They recognize rights of water and environmental rights as itself. And then, and the second case is La Oroya against Peru. It changed a lot because it's not only to talk about environmental issues. They start to talk about like some lines about the rights of nature. How? Because they start to talk about water, and they say, in the case of a river, they say, the judge says, clearly you could say here that you protect the river because you need it, like the anthropocentric view, for example, drinking water, food, etc. But then the judge says, but you need to protect water in the river as itself. So this is the change that the jurisprudence, like in some lines, starts to do. And then in the consulting opinion, change a lot specific because they said it's necessarily to understand climate change, the responsibility of the states, and of course, rights of nature, because rights of nature for the court is the responsibility to try to protect some others' rights. So probably the quick response is that it depends in each country. For example, in our country, in Ecuador, for example, consulting opinions is mandatory, and we could apply it, but we have the recognition of rights of nature. In my first slide that I showed previously, I showed that right now it's not only from global south. Now is rights of nature is a global movement that starts to expand. Probably not in the I don't know, in the way that a lot of people want to, for example, like have probably like a international treaty, but probably in some case like this, we will need to talk more about it, and probably in legislation or about in each case, the judges will use the concept of rights of nature.
Another viewer of ours, Yin Yin, has also asked us to look up. And she said, what about international financial institutions like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc.? They're increasingly backing nature-based solutions. How should they incorporate rights of nature into their funding decisions and development-centered operations? Does anyone want to take on that question?
I love it. Well, I think your point is well taken in that they have established the code of conduct, right? Like we think of the Ecuador principles, right? Which is something that IFC created, and several multilaterals and private multinationals have signed, right? To be able to make sure that the investments fulfill certain requirements, both in terms of the environmental performance as well as participation and consent, local consent and informed consent for indigenous groups. So we're moving the ball, the mark, right? And we're establishing a set of rules that I think are changing the way that operations function. And I think as these international lawsuits gain exposure, and thank you, Cornell and Milfred, for having this space, so that people don't think of rights of nature as kind of this peripheral tendency, but rather something that is starting to become a trend. We can change the conversation and change it at all levels, both from governments, from investors, from the social society, and think of ways where we can make sure that we can have development without environmental destruction. And I do think that even within a capitalist framework, there are limits. There are limits. We don't accept slavery anymore. We think women have a right to vote. Well, now we're saying nature also has a right to be defended. And I think that changes the conversation. And I think it's something that, especially for young people, it doesn't seem crazy. It's very much actually questionable. Why do we want to build economies destroying nature? Because it becomes very costly. People are getting cancer. People are getting sick. We're eating shit. I'm sorry to use the term, but that's something that it's unacceptable and we need to change it.
Changing the conversation. I think that's really important, and it's one thing that the whole rights of nature debate and movement has done. Our last question is more specific to Ecuador, and Carlos, I'm going to direct it to you. It says, Pooja says, speaking of capitalism, can Ecuador's agricultural exports compensate earnings from oil to push towards nature finance, leading to nature capitalism? And maybe not to be that specific, let's just ask about the potential for nature capitalism. Ugh, nature capitalism? Is that where we want to go with this rights of nature discussion?
Yes, I think it's a wonderful question, and that there are many things to think to say about that, but I want to focus my words on the role of the economical sphere in a global scale, because we have on one hand we have a periphery based on extractive industries like mining, like oil. But on the other hand, we have these rights now, these rights of nature, even in a capitalist context. Um, there are many another examples of that. For instance, in the German case that is part of my doctoral dissertation, we have okay, we don't have the rights of nature recognized in the German constitution, but the spirit of the rights of nature that are involved on the young people, on the young collectives that fight against the extraction of of coal, and protect the forest in Germany, no? So there are a lot of things to say in terms of rights of nature and capitalism. It sound quite not so good, but I think that we can do efforts to the right direction in terms of rights of nature if we study that kind of cases, no, like the German case, the New Zealander case, and even the Ecuadorian case in a context of a global economy.
So we're going to wrap up now, and I'm going to invite each of the speakers to give us a final provocation or a final thought. I also encourage the viewers to go check out our special issue, which we'll put again in the chat. But I want to start with Judge Avila. You laid out some conditions that we needed to have. Do you want to add to those, or do you want to offer some final advice on where we go? You'll need to unmute.
Thanks, Mildred. I want to say that we are probably in the worst ecological catastrophe ever provoked by human species. I mean, this climate collapse, to me, is worse than the war, than all the things that human beings have ever done in the history. To shift, it is necessary to shift to other way of seeing nature. I mean, otherwise, not only the human species, but the whole living on Earth is in danger. So to shift the paradigm is not only necessary but urgent. And to me, rights of nature give us a deep insight into this content of the new paradigm. That would be my last word, Mildred.
Great, thank you. Shift the conversation, new paradigm. Lisa?
I agree. I think that one of the things I would suggest is go down to your rivers, go to your water bodies closest to you and start listening. Join other people and think about how you can change, how we can change our relationship to those living water bodies about us. How can we activate our collective imagination, our collective intelligence? We have the ability to think differently. We have, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, human beings have acted differently and have lived in a more harmonious relationship with nature. This is a blip in sort of geological history, this moment when we're devouring the world. I think we're a very young species, and I think we can grow up and start asking different questions and start to relate again to our living world in a way that's respectful and that restores that relationship, and we can find new ways forward.
Great, thank you for that idea. Marta?
Yes, I think in the bottom line is that water captures everything, all the good and all the bad. And what I think is crazy is that as a species, we're putting at risk the product, the bountiful, the beauty that we need every day of our lives. Rivers and water are key to our livelihood and to our serenity and to our existence. And we need to act and act now. And people need to know what's happening to their water sources, what's happening with their water. So I invite the audience to find out, because I'm sure if you find out, you're not going to like what you see, because politicians and investors are making decisions that are affecting the basis of our existence. And it's, as Ramiro said, an urgent call to get involved, find out what's happening, and make sure that we all defend water and water sources, which are the key to any economy, to any livelihood, to any society today in the world.
And I'm going to turn the last word to Andres.
Yeah, in my case, I will try to be a little provocative to have these final words that is very important, I think, to winning rights of nature case, but it's not the end of the process and is the beginning of a much more difficult stage. For example, how to finance, monitor, and actually execute the reparation measure. So the river restoration, in fact, requires money, technical capacity, monitoring, and a long-term institutional commitment. So probably in our research and in our paper, we said that academics, for example, become essential because universities, for example, can provide scientific evidence, water quality monitoring, ecological assessment. But of course, on the other hand, civil society groups bring this legitimacy, community knowledge, and political pressure. And of course, the academics help to translate those demands into technical zones and legally enforceable measures. So it's very important to connect these different parts of the community to try to solve this big problem of pollution rivers and, of course, pollution ecosystems.
Thank you, Andres. And to end on a slightly more positive note, one of the cases that Andres and I have in our paper in the special issue is about the River Rouge in Detroit, which was on fire, literally, back in the 1970s. And through a multi-level governance effort of the federal government, the state, all the localities, civil society, scientists, it's now swimmable and fishable again. So this dream to swim in the river again can be realized. I want to thank Cornell. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank our audience for your participation today. I want to remind you that today's live stream is recorded and will be available to view shortly. You can find it on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook Live, but you can find it at this very link that you're watching at now. You can watch it again. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, today. We're pleased to have you in the conversation. And thank you.